The Nebraska prairie stretched endlessly under a steel-gray winter sky, its frozen ground concealing secrets that would soon change everything. In this unforgiving landscape, where hope froze as quickly as morning breath, a woman stepped off. The evening train, carrying nothing but a worn carpet bag and a marriage contract to a man she'd never met. But hidden in the abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of Millbrook Township lay a discovery that would test every ounce of courage she possessed. 6 tiny souls clinging to life, forgotten by the world, but about to be found by someone who understood what it meant to be unwanted. This is the story of how one woman's desperate circumstances became the salvation of an entire community, and how sometimes the most broken people are exactly who the world needs to heal its deepest wounds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. November 15th, 1887, Millbrook Township, Nebraska. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore pressed her face against the frost-covered window of the passenger car, watching the endless expanse of Nebraska farmland roll past in the dying light of a bitter autumn day. At 24, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that spoke of inner strength rather than vanity. Auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, green eyes that had seen too much hardship too young, and hands that bore the calluses of honest work. But it was her expression that told the real story, a mixture of determination and barely controlled terror that belonged to someone who had run out of choices. The marriage contract tucked inside her worn leather purse crinkled slightly as the train swayed. Margaret had read it so many times over the past 3 weeks that she could recite every formal, emotionless line from memory. Harold James Morrison, widower, age 38. Seeks respectable woman for marriage and household management. Room, board and protection provided in exchange for domestic duties and companionship. No romantic expectations. Arrangement purely practical. The words had seemed like salvation when she'd first responded to the advertisement in the Boston Herald. Now, as the train wheezed to a stop at what could charitably be called a station, little more than a wooden platform beside a single-story building, they felt more like a death sentence. Margaret gathered her few belongings and stepped onto the platform, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Millbrook Township consisted of perhaps 20 buildings clustered along a single dusty street that the approaching winter had turned into frozen ruts. A general store, a saloon, what appeared to be a church, and scattered houses that looked as weather-beaten and weary as she felt. It was the kind of place people ended up when they had nowhere else to go. Miss Whitmore. The voice belonged to a tall, lean man in his late 30s, with prematurely grey hair and eyes the colour of winter sky. His clothes were clean but patched, his manner polite but distant. This, she realized with a sinking heart, was Harold Morrison, her husband-to-be. "Mr. Morrison," she replied, extending a gloved hand that he shook briefly before stepping back, as if physical contact made him uncomfortable. "I trust your journey was tolerable," he said, taking her carpet bag with mechanical courtesy. "The wagon's just there. We'll have you settled before full dark." The conversation during the 20-minute ride to Morrison's farm was stilted and practical. He explained the basic layout of his property, the expectations for meals and household maintenance, and the fact that she would have her own room in the farmhouse with a lock on the door. Margaret appreciated the last detail more than he could know. It suggested a man who understood the vulnerabilities of her situation, even if he seemed incapable of acknowledging them directly. The Morrison farm sat on a slight rise overlooking a creek that was already beginning to show ice along its edges. The farmhouse itself was larger than Margaret had expected, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch that might have been welcoming in better weather. But even in the gathering, dusk She could see signs of neglect, sagging shutters, missing porch railings, a barn with gaps in its siding that spoke of work deferred too long. "My first wife died 3 years ago," Harold said abruptly as they approached the house. "Consumption. I've been managing alone since then, but—" He gestured vaguely at the deteriorating buildings. "A man needs help to keep a place like this." "Running proper," Margaret nodded, understanding more than he'd actually said. Harold Morrison wasn't looking for a wife. He was looking for an employee he could trust not to steal from him or abandon him when times got hard. It wasn't romantic, but it was honest. And after the lies and false promises that had driven her from Boston, honesty felt like a luxury she couldn't afford to criticize. The interior of the farmhouse confirmed her suspicions. The rooms were clean but sparse, functional rather than comfortable. The kitchen showed signs of recent use, but lacked any personal touches. No curtains, no flowers, no indication that anyone had ever tried to make this house feel like a home. It was the dwelling of a man who had forgotten how to live, and was merely surviving. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the right," Harold said, setting her bag at the foot of the stairs. "There's a wash basin and clean linens. I generally eat at 6 sharp, breakfast at sunrise, dinner when the work's done. I don't expect conversation during meals unless there's business to discuss." Margaret climbed the narrow stairs to what would be her refuge for the foreseeable future. The room was small but adequate, with a single window that looked out over the frozen fields and a bed that appeared to have been recently made with fresh sheets. Someone, Harold she assumed, had left a pitcher of water and clean towels on the washstand. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and after months of sleeping in boarding houses and train stations, having a space with a locking door felt like unimaginable luxury. As she unpacked her few belongings, Margaret allowed herself to think about the circumstances that had brought her to this isolated farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. 6 months ago, she had been Margaret Whitmore, assistant seamstress in a respectable Boston dress shop, sharing a small apartment with 2 other working women and saving every penny toward opening her own establishment someday. She had been independent, hopeful, even happy in her modest way. Then Thomas Kellerman had walked into Mrs. Patterson's dress shop with his easy smile and well-tailored clothes, claiming to be a successful merchant looking for a wife with practical skills and moral character. Margaret had been flattered by his attention, charmed by his courtship, and eventually convinced to accept his proposal of marriage. She had even agreed to his suggestion that she contribute her savings to their joint venture, a new business that would secure their future together. The wedding had taken place on a rainy Thursday in September. By Friday evening, Thomas Kellerman had disappeared along with every penny Margaret had saved over 5 years of careful living. Worse, she discovered that he had used her name to secure credit at several Boston merchants, leaving her responsible for debts she had never agreed to and couldn't possibly pay. The respectable Miss Whitmore had become, overnight, a woman with a reputation for dishonesty and a pile of obligations that would take years to resolve. Mrs. Patterson had been sympathetic but firm. She couldn't afford to employ someone whose presence might drive away customers who'd heard the rumors about Margaret's involvement in her husband's schemes. The other seamstresses had been polite but distant, unwilling to risk their own reputations by associating too closely with someone touched by scandal. Margaret's roommates had asked her to find other accommodations, worried that her creditors might cause problems for them as well. Within 2 months, Margaret had gone from independent working woman to unemployable pariah. The few jobs available to women of questionable reputation, tavern work, factory labor, or worse, held dangers that terrified her more than poverty itself. When she saw Harold Morrison's advertisement for a mail-order bride, it had seemed like her only chance to escape Boston before her situation became completely desperate. Now, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed in a house that felt more like a business arrangement than a home, Margaret wondered if she had simply traded one form of desperation for another. Harold Morrison was clearly a decent man. He had kept his word about providing her with privacy and safety, but he was also profoundly isolated, both geographically and emotionally. Margaret suspected that he was as damaged by his first wife's death as she was by Thomas Kellerman's betrayal, and she wasn't sure that two wounded people could provide each other with any real healing. The sound of Harold moving around downstairs reminded her that she needed to start earning her keep immediately. She had promised to manage his household, and that meant preparing dinner, even though she was exhausted from travel and overwhelmed by the strangeness of her new situation. Margaret changed into her plainest dress, tied an apron around her waist, and went downstairs to explore the kitchen more thoroughly. What she found was both encouraging and depressing. Harold had stocked the pantry adequately: flour, salt pork, dried beans, preserved vegetables, enough staples to feed two people through the winter. But everything was purely functional, chosen for nutrition and keeping quality rather than flavor or variety. It was the food selection of a man who ate to survive rather than for any pleasure or comfort. Margaret had learned to cook by necessity during her years of independent living, and she took pride in being able to create appealing meals from simple ingredients. Tonight, she decided she would make something that might remind Harold Morrison that food could be more than mere fuel. She found potatoes in the root cellar, salt pork in the smokehouse, and enough dried herbs to add some flavor to what would otherwise be a plain but filling meal. As she worked, Margaret became aware of sounds from outside: Harold completing his evening chores in the barn, the lowing of cattle, the restless movement of chickens settling for the night. These were the sounds of a working farm, and despite her urban upbringing, Margaret found them oddly comforting. There was something honest about the rhythms of agricultural life, something that spoke of seasons and cycles and the kind of permanence that had been missing from her recent existence. Harold returned to the house just as she was setting the table, bringing with him the smells of hay and cold air. He nodded approvingly at the meal she had prepared, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "Smells good," he said simply, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. They ate in the silence he had warned her to expect, but Margaret noticed that he finished everything on his plate, and even took a second helping of the potatoes she had seasoned with dried rosemary. It wasn't much of a compliment, but for a man who seemed to have forgotten how to express pleasure in anything, it felt like progress. After dinner, Harold retreated to what appeared to be a small office off the main room, where Margaret could hear him working on what sounded like account books. She cleaned the kitchen thoroughly, learning the location of dishes and utensils, beginning the process of understanding how this household functioned. When she finished, she found Harold still bent over his papers by lamplight. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, not wanting to startle him, "I wanted to thank you for keeping your word about the arrangements. I know this situation is unusual for both of us, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to make a fresh start." Harold looked up from his books, studying her face in the yellow glow of the oil lamp. For a moment, his careful reserve seemed to crack slightly, revealing something that might have been loneliness or regret. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, "I hope you won't have cause to regret coming here. This isn't an easy life, especially for someone accustomed to city conveniences. Winters are long and hard, and there aren't many people around for company." "I'm not afraid of hard work or solitude," Margaret replied, "and after recent experiences, I've learned to value honesty and safety more than convenience or society." Something in her tone must have conveyed more than her words, because Harold's expression softened slightly. "We'll make the best of it," he said. "Both of us." As Margaret prepared for her first night in her new home, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been planning a future based on love and partnership. Tonight, she was beginning a marriage based on mutual need and practical considerations. It wasn't what she had dreamed of, but it was honest, and it was safe, and it offered the possibility of building something meaningful from the wreckage of her previous hopes. Outside her window, the Nebraska wind moaned across the frozen prairie, carrying with it the promise of a harsh winter ahead. But inside the farmhouse, Margaret felt warmer than she had in months. She had a roof over her head, useful work to do, and a partner who might not love her, but who respected her enough to honor his agreements. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was a life she could build on. And after everything she had been through, that felt like more than enough. What Margaret didn't know, as she drifted off to sleep in her narrow bed, was that less than 2 miles away, in an abandoned farmhouse that the locals whispered was haunted, 6 tiny voices were crying into the winter darkness, voices that would soon lead her toward a purpose she had never imagined and a love deeper than any romantic fantasy she had ever entertained. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. November 20th, 1887. 5 days later. The morning that would change everything began like any other in Margaret's new routine. She rose before dawn, dressed quickly in the bone-chilling cold, and made her way downstairs to start the fire and prepare Harold's breakfast. Over the past 5 days, they had settled into a rhythm of polite coexistence. He managed the outdoor work, while she handled the household, and they shared meals in companionable silence that was slowly becoming less awkward. Margaret had begun to understand Harold Morrison better through observation than conversation. He was a man carved hollow by grief, going through the motions of living without any real engagement with life itself. His farm was well managed but joyless, his routines efficient but mechanical. She suspected that before his wife's death, this house had been filled with warmth and laughter. Now it felt like a shrine to loss, carefully maintained but emotionally abandoned. As she mixed batter for flapjacks, Margaret noticed Harold standing at the kitchen window, staring toward the eastern ridge with an expression of deep concern. The wind had been howling all night, driving snow across the prairie in sheets that made visibility nearly impossible. "Storm's getting worse," he said without turning around. "Worst November weather I've seen in years. Temperatures dropping fast, and the wind's picking up. We might lose some cattle if they can't find shelter." Margaret joined him at the window, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cold that seemed to seep through the glass. In the grey pre-dawn light, she could see snow swirling in violent patterns across the fields, creating drifts that rose and it felt like ocean waves frozen in time. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked. Harold glanced at her with something that might have been surprise. His previous wife, Margaret, was beginning to understand, had probably been content to leave all outdoor concerns entirely to him. The idea that his current wife might actually want to contribute beyond cooking and cleaning seemed to catch him off guard. "I need to check the south pasture," he said slowly. "Make sure the cattle found their way to the windbreak. It's dangerous. Work in weather like this, easy to get turned around and lost. But if you're serious about helping, you could watch for my signal fires. I'll light one when I've secured each group of animals. If you don't see a fire within 2 hours of my departure, something's gone wrong." The trust implied in his request touched Margaret more than any romantic gesture could have. Harold was acknowledging that she was capable of responsible action in a crisis, that her judgment could be relied upon when it mattered. After months of being treated as either a victim or a liability, being asked to serve as someone's safety, line felt like a restoration of her fundamental dignity. "I'll watch for your signals," she promised, "and Harold, be careful out there." The use of his first name slipped out naturally, and Margaret saw his eyes widen slightly at the unexpected. Intimacy. For a moment, something warm flickered across his features before the familiar reserve reasserted itself. "I always am," he said simply, but his tone carried a note of something that hadn't been there before. Harold left just after sunrise, bundled, in heavy coats, and leading his most reliable horse through snow that was already knee-deep in places. Margaret positioned herself at the kitchen window with hot coffee and Harold's field glasses, scanning the horizon for the signal fires that would tell her he was safe. The first fire appeared exactly 90 minutes after his departure, a thin column of smoke rising from the vicinity of the creek where Harold kept his breeding stock. Margaret felt a surge of relief and made a careful note of the time in the margin of one of Harold's farming journals. The second fire took longer, nearly 3 hours, and by the time she spotted it, Margaret was pacing the kitchen floor and fighting the urge to saddle a horse and go looking for him herself. It was while she was watching for the third signal, fire, that Margaret first heard the sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come. At first, she thought it was the wind, a high, thin wailing that seemed to rise and fall, with the gusts battering the farmhouse. But as she listened more carefully, Margaret realized there was something too rhythmic about the sound, too purposeful. It wasn't the random howling of air through broken boards or loose shutters. It was something else entirely, something that sounded disturbingly like crying. Margaret grabbed Harold's field glasses and began scanning the landscape more systematically, looking for anything that might explain the mysterious sound. The snow made visibility poor, but she could make out the dark shapes of the nearest buildings: Harold's barn, the chicken coop, the small storage shed where he kept tools and equipment. But there, about half a mile to the northeast, barely visible through the swirling snow, stood a structure she hadn't noticed before. It was larger than a shed, but smaller than a proper house, with broken windows and a sagging roof that spoke of long abandonment. Even through the field glasses, Margaret could see that the building was in terrible condition, the kind of place that sensible people avoided. The crying sound seemed to be coming from that direction. Margaret lowered the glasses, telling herself she was imagining things. The human mind, she knew, was capable of finding patterns and meanings in random noise, especially when a person was stressed or worried. The sound was probably just wind through the broken windows of the abandoned building, distorted by distance, and weather into something that resembled human distress. But even as she tried to rationalize away what she had heard, Margaret found herself unable to concentrate on anything else. She attempted to focus on household tasks, mending Harold's torn work shirt, organizing the pantry, planning the next day's meals. But her attention kept drifting back to that eerie wailing sound that continued to rise and fall with heartbreaking regularity. By mid-afternoon, when Harold finally returned from his cattle-checking expedition, Margaret was nearly frantic with curiosity and concern. He stomped into the house covered with snow and ice, his face red with cold, but his expression satisfied. "All the animals are accounted for," he reported, accepting the hot coffee Margaret pressed into his frozen hands. "Lost a few fence posts to the wind, but nothing that can't be repaired when the weather breaks. How did you manage? Any problems here?" Margaret hesitated, unsure how to broach the subject of the mysterious sounds without seeming hysterical or foolish. Harold was a practical man who dealt in concrete realities: cattle, crops, weather, and market prices. He might not appreciate his new wife claiming to hear phantom crying in abandoned buildings. "Harold," she said carefully, "there's a building to the northeast of here, maybe half a mile away. Old, looks abandoned. What is it?" Harold's expression darkened immediately, and Margaret saw his entire body tense, as if she had mentioned something. "Painful or dangerous? That's the old Brennan place," he said flatly. "Family moved away 2 years ago after their youngest boy died of the fever. House has been empty since then." "Why?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "I thought I heard sounds." coming from that direction today, probably just the wind through broken windows, but it was so strange. Almost like crying. Harold finished, his voice grim. Yes, I've heard it too. So have most of the neighbors. Local folks think the place is haunted, say it's the ghost of the Brennan boy calling for his mother. Margaret studied Harold's face, trying to read his expression. But you don't believe in ghosts? No, I don't, Harold replied firmly. But I do believe in staying away from places that bring nothing but trouble. The Brennan house has been nothing but tragedy for everyone who's had anything to do with it. First family that lived there lost 3 children to typhoid. Second family had their barn struck by lightning and lost everything. The Brennans themselves. He shook his head. Well, you can see how that ended. Despite Harold's warnings, Margaret found herself unable to dismiss the sounds she had heard. That evening, as she prepared dinner, the wailing began again. Fainter now, but still audible whenever the wind died down enough to allow other sounds through. It was definitely coming from the direction of the abandoned house, and it definitely sounded like human distress. Harold, she said during their quiet dinner, what if it's not a ghost? What if someone is actually in trouble out there? Harold set down his fork and fixed her with a steady stare. Margaret, I appreciate that you have a kind heart, but you need to understand something about life out here. We're isolated, sometimes for weeks at a time during bad weather. People learn to take care of themselves because help might not be available when they need it. Anyone foolish enough to take shelter in that ruin would be making their own poor choices. But what if it's not someone who chose to be there? Margaret persisted. What if it's someone who got lost in the storm, or injured, or then they should have been more careful? Harold interrupted, his tone carrying a finality that Margaret was beginning to recognize. I won't risk your safety or mine on wild speculation about phantom sounds from a cursed house. The subject is closed. Margaret nodded obediently, but privately she disagreed completely with Harold's assessment. She had grown up in Boston, where neighbors looked out for each other, and where ignoring someone's distress was considered a moral failure. The idea of deliberately avoiding the investigation of potential human suffering went against everything she had been taught about Christian duty and basic human decency. That night, as Margaret lay in her narrow bed, listening to the storm rage outside, she made a decision that would have terrified her just weeks earlier. Tomorrow, weather permitting, she was going to visit the abandoned Brennan house and discover the source of those heartbreaking sounds. Harold wouldn't approve, but Harold didn't need to know about every detail of how she spent her time while he was working. The crying continued throughout the night, fainter sometimes, but never completely absent. And now that Margaret was listening, carefully she could swear she heard something else mixed in with the wailing, something that sounded almost like words, though she couldn't make out what they were saying. As dawn approached, Margaret made careful plans. She would wait until Harold departed for his morning chores, then bundle herself warmly and make the trek to the Brennan house while visibility was good. If she found nothing more than wind-damaged buildings, she would return home and never mention the subject again. But if there was genuinely someone in distress out there, she was prepared to help them, regardless of Harold's objections. What Margaret didn't anticipate, as she drifted off to sleep with her mind full of rescue plans, was exactly what kind of help would be needed, or how completely the discovery she was about to make would transform not only her own life, but the entire character of the isolated farming community that had become her new home. The crying in the wind was real, and it was human. And it was coming from 6 tiny throats that belonged to souls who had been forgotten by everyone except the woman who was finally brave enough to investigate the sounds that everyone else dismissed as supernatural nonsense. Tomorrow, Margaret, Elizabeth Whitmore Morrison would discover that sometimes the most important thing you can do with your life is to pay attention to the voices that everyone else chooses to ignore. November 21st, 1887. Dawn Margaret woke before the rooster crowed, her body tense with the anticipation of what she was about to do. The storm had finally begun to weaken during the night, though snow still fell in gentle flakes that promised to make her journey treacherous. She dressed quickly in her warmest clothes, wool stockings, her heaviest skirt, a thick sweater, and the sturdy boots she had purchased for farm life. Harold was already moving around downstairs, preparing for another day of storm damage assessment. Margaret forced herself to go through her normal morning routine, making coffee and breakfast while fighting the nervous energy that threatened to betray her intentions. She couldn't afford to act suspiciously. Harold was observant, and any unusual behavior might prompt questions she wasn't ready to answer. "Weather's clearing," Harold observed, over his morning eggs and bacon. "Should be able to get a good look at the fence damage today. Might be gone most of the morning checking the northern boundary." Margaret nodded, keeping her expression neutral, despite the surge of relief that ran through her. A morning absence would give her plenty of time to investigate the Brennan house and return before Harold suspected anything. "I'll probably spend the morning working on that quilt I started," she said, surprised by how easily the lie came to her lips. "Good weather for indoor projects." Harold finished his breakfast and bundled himself against the cold, pausing at the door to give Margaret one of his rare, almost smiles. "Stay warm. And Margaret, if you hear those sounds again today, just ignore them. Some things are better left alone." After Harold disappeared across the snow-covered fields, Margaret waited another 20 minutes to be certain he was well away from the house. Then she began her own preparations for what might be the most important expedition of her life. She packed a canvas bag with supplies that seemed practical for any emergency she might encounter. Clean rags that could serve as bandages, a jar of water, some bread and dried meat, matches, a small knife, and the bottle of laudanum she had, brought from Boston for headaches. The walk to the Brennan house was more difficult than Margaret had anticipated. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind still carried enough force to make her eyes water and her cheeks burn with cold. Several times she lost her footing and had to struggle back to her feet, her heavy skirts making movement awkward and exhausting. But as she drew closer to the abandoned building, the crying sounds became unmistakably clear. This was definitely not wind through broken windows. These were human voices, multiple voices, wailing with the kind of desperation that spoke of genuine distress. The Brennan house, when Margaret finally reached it, was even more dilapidated than it had appeared from a distance. The front porch had partially collapsed, leaving jagged boards and dangerous gaps. Several windows were completely missing, their frames dark and empty, like hollow eye sockets. The roof sagged ominously, and Margaret could see daylight through gaps in the walls, but the crying was definitely coming from inside. Margaret circled the building carefully, looking for a safe way to enter. The front door hung askew on broken hinges, and the porch was too unstable to risk. But around the back, she found a ground-level window that was large enough to climb through and seemed structurally sound. As she approached the window, the sounds became clearer and more heartbreaking. Margaret could now distinguish individual voices, high, thin wails that belonged unmistakably to very young children. Her heart began to pound with a mixture of excitement and terror. Children. There were children trapped in this ruin, and from the sound of their cries, they were in serious distress. Margaret boosted herself through the window with considerable difficulty, her heavy clothing catching on the frame and her boots slipping on the ice-covered sill. She landed heavily on the floor of what had once been the Brennan family's kitchen, her arrival sending a family of mice scurrying for cover. The interior of the house was a nightmare of decay and abandonment. Wallpaper hung in rotting strips, furniture lay overturned and broken, and the smell of mold and animal waste was almost overwhelming. But the crying was much louder now, coming from what appeared to be a back bedroom. Margaret made her way carefully through the debris-strewn rooms, testing each floorboard before putting her full weight on it. The house groaned and creaked around her, and she could feel cold air flowing through gaps in the walls that were wide enough to see through. When she finally reached the source of the crying, Margaret stopped in the doorway, too shocked to move. 6 children, babies, really, lay on a collection of dirty blankets in the corner of the room. The oldest appeared to be perhaps 2 years old. The youngest couldn't have been more than a few months. They were painfully thin, their clothes little more than rags, their faces red and chapped from crying and cold. Empty food tins and a few scattered belongings suggested that someone had been caring for them, but there was no adult in sight. "Oh, dear God," Margaret whispered, rushing forward to kneel beside the makeshift nursery. The children's reaction to her presence was immediate and heartbreaking. The older ones stretched their arms toward her with desperate hunger for human contact, while the babies simply continued their weak, exhausted wailing. Margaret could see that they were all suffering from exposure, malnutrition, and what appeared to be various stages of illness. Margaret gathered the nearest child, a little girl with tangled blonde hair and enormous blue eyes, into her arms. The child was shockingly light, her small body burning with fever. She clung to Margaret with the desperation of someone who had given up hope of rescue and then suddenly found salvation. "Mama," the little girl whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "Mama gone." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she looked around at the other children. A little boy, who couldn't have been more than 18 months old, was trying to comfort an even smaller baby, patting the infant's back with the instinctive gentleness of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. 2 more toddlers huddled together for warmth, their lips blue with cold, despite the pile of inadequate blankets. "Where are your parents?" Margaret asked the oldest girl, though she suspected the answer would break her heart. "Mama sick, Papa gone. Lady come take care, but Lady gone too," the child replied in the simple sentences of someone too young to fully understand her circumstances. Margaret quickly assessed the situation. 6 abandoned children, obviously suffering from neglect and exposure, in a building that was barely standing and offered no protection from the winter weather. They needed immediate medical attention, food, warmth, and safety, none of which she could provide in this ruined house. But bringing 6 children home to Harold's farm would require explanations that she wasn't sure he would accept. Margaret knew her husband well enough by now to understand that his practical nature would rebel against taking on such an enormous responsibility, especially for children whose origins were completely unknown. Still, there was no choice. These children would die if left here, and Margaret would not be able to live with herself if she walked away from such obvious need. Margaret spent the next hour doing what she could to stabilize the children's immediate condition. She used her water and clean rags to wash their faces and hands, gave them small pieces of bread to eat, and wrapped them more warmly in her own shawl and the blankets from her bag. The youngest baby, a little boy who couldn't have been more than 4 months old, was in the worst condition, barely conscious and struggling to breathe. "What are your names?" Margaret asked the older children as she worked. "Emma," said the little girl who had called her Mama. "This is Tommy and Sarah and baby James. Don't know the others' names. Lady called them Sweetie." Margaret felt a fresh surge of anger at whatever circumstances had led to these children being abandoned in such a dangerous place. Even if their parents were dead, surely there were relatives, community members, or church organizations that should have taken responsibility for their welfare. But those questions could wait. Right now, Margaret needed to focus on getting six sick, malnourished children safely to Harold's farm without losing any of them to the cold or their various illnesses. Margaret made multiple trips between the Brennan house and the Morrison farm, carrying two children at a time through the snow while fighting exhaustion and the growing certainty that she was about to create a crisis that would test her marriage to its very foundations. By the time she had transported all six children to her kitchen, she was trembling with cold and effort, and the babies were crying with renewed vigor. Though now it was the demanding cries of children who had hope for food and warmth rather than the despairing wails of the abandoned. Margaret heated milk on the stove, warmed blankets by the fire, and began the process of feeding and cleaning six desperately needy children while constantly listening for Harold's return. She had perhaps an hour before he came back for his midday meal, and she still hadn't figured out how to explain the presence of half a dozen unexpected house guests. As she worked, Margaret found herself marveling at the children's resilience. Despite their obvious suffering, they responded quickly to kindness and care. Emma appointed herself as Margaret's assistant, helping to comfort the younger children and explaining their needs in her limited vocabulary. Tommy, despite being barely old enough to walk steadily, showed remarkable protective instincts toward baby James, refusing to be separated from the infant and carefully watching Margaret's every movement to ensure she was being gentle. But it was the youngest child, a little girl who appeared to be about 6 months old, who captured Margaret's heart most completely. The baby had enormous dark eyes and wispy brown hair, and despite her obvious illness, she managed to smile when Margaret held her close. Someone had loved this child enough to keep her clean and well-tended until very recently, and Margaret felt a fierce surge of protective anger toward whoever had abandoned such a precious soul. The sound of Harold's boots on the front porch sent panic through Margaret's entire body. There was no way to hide 6 children, no excuse that would make their presence seem reasonable, and no time to prepare Harold for what he was about to discover. Margaret gathered the baby girl closer to her chest and braced herself for a confrontation that could determine the fate of 6 innocent lives. Harold opened the front door, stomped the snow off his boots, and called out his usual greeting. "Margaret, I'm back. Something smells good in—" He stopped in the kitchen doorway, his expression shifting from casual expectation to complete bewilderment as he took in the scene before him. 6 small children in various stages of being fed and cleaned, blankets and baby clothes scattered across every surface, and his wife standing in the middle of it all with a baby in her arms and an expression of desperate determination on her face. "Margaret," Harold said very quietly, "what exactly is going on here?" November 21st, 1887, midday. The silence that followed Harold's question seemed to stretch for an eternity. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, the soft whimpering of the children and the crackle of the fire in the stove. Harold stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes moving from child to child as if trying to make sense of an impossible situation. "Harold," Margaret began, her voice steadier than she felt. "These children were abandoned in the Brennan house. They were dying of cold and hunger. I couldn't leave them there." Harold stepped fully into the kitchen, removing his hat with mechanical precision. His face had gone completely pale, and Margaret could see a muscle twitching in his jaw, a sign she was learning meant he was struggling to control strong emotions. "6 children," he said slowly, as if speaking the words would help him process their reality. "You brought 6 children to our house without discussing it with me first." "There wasn't time to discuss it," Margaret replied, lifting her chin defensively. "They needed immediate help. Look at them, Harold. Look at their condition." Harold's gaze swept over the children again, and Margaret saw his expression soften slightly as he took in their obvious suffering. Little Emma was clinging to Margaret's skirt with one hand while trying to comfort baby James with the other. Tommy had fallen asleep, standing up, swaying dangerously until Margaret steadied him with her free arm. The youngest baby girl was burning. With fever, her tiny face flushed and her breathing labored. "They're sick," Harold observed, and there was something in his voice that Margaret couldn't quite identify. "All of them." "Yes, they need medical attention. Dr. Patterson in town—" "Dr. Patterson died last month," Harold interrupted grimly. "Heart attack. Nearest doctor now is in Fremont. 2 days hard riding in good weather. In this snow it might as well be the moon." Margaret felt her heart sink. She'd been counting on professional medical help to stabilize the children's condition, while she and Harold figured out long-term arrangements. Without a doctor, she would be entirely responsible for nursing 6 sick children back to health, with only her limited knowledge and whatever supplies they had on hand. "Then we'll have to manage on our own," she said, with more confidence than she felt. Harold walked slowly around the kitchen, examining each child with the careful attention he usually reserved for evaluating livestock. But there was nothing cold or calculating in his assessment. If anything, Margaret could see genuine concern growing in his expression as he noticed details she had missed in her initial panic. "This one has pneumonia," he said, kneeling beside the baby girl Margaret was holding. "Listen to her breathing. And this boy," he gestured toward Tommy, "those marks on his arms look like old burns. Someone hurt these children before they were abandoned." Margaret felt a surge of rage at the thought of anyone deliberately harming such vulnerable innocents. All the more reason they need protection now. Harold stood up, running a hand through his hair, in a gesture Margaret recognized as his way of dealing with overwhelming stress. "Margaret, do you understand what you've done? Taking in 6 children isn't like adopting a stray cat. These are human beings who will need food, clothing, medical care, education, years of support. We barely know each other, and you've just made us responsible for 6 lives without asking if I was prepared for such a commitment." The criticism stung because Margaret knew it was partially justified. She had acted impulsively, driven by emotion rather than practical consideration. But as she looked down at the baby in her arms, the child who had smiled at her despite being desperately ill, Margaret knew she would make the same choice again. "You're right," she said quietly. "I should have discussed it with you first." "But Harold, if you had seen them in that frozen house, crying and starving and dying by degrees, could you really have walked away?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, studying Margaret's face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice was very soft. "No," he admitted. "I couldn't have walked away either. But that doesn't change the practical problems we're facing." Before Margaret could respond, little Emma tugged on her skirt and looked up with enormous worried eyes. "Are you going to send us away?" she asked in her small, clear voice. "The lady before said she might have to send us away if we were too much trouble." Margaret felt her heart break at the fear in the child's question. She knelt down to Emma's level, still holding the sick baby, and spoke with gentle firmness. "No, sweetheart, we're not going to send you away. You're safe here." "Promise?" Emma whispered. "I promise," Margaret replied, looking directly at Harold as she spoke. "We're going to take care of all of you." Harold's expression shifted as he watched the interaction between Margaret and Emma. Something in his face softened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried resignation rather than anger. "Margaret, you can't make promises about what we are going to do without consulting me first." "Then tell me," Margaret said, standing up to face him directly. "Tell me what you want to do, because these children are here now. They're in our house, and they need immediate decisions about their care." Harold walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered fields, as if the winter landscape might provide answers to their dilemma. Margaret held her breath, knowing that his next words would determine not only the fate of 6 innocent children, but also the future of their marriage. The practical problems are enormous, Harold said finally, still facing away from her. We don't have enough beds, enough warm clothing, enough food stored for winter to feed 8 people instead of 2. We don't know anything about these children's backgrounds, who their parents were, whether they have relatives looking for them, what kind of legal complications might arise from taking them in. Margaret's heart sank with each word. But Harold wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, 6 sick children are going to require constant care. Someone will need to be with them around the clock until they recover. That means the regular farm work, cooking, cleaning, animal care will suffer. We could lose livestock, fall behind on essential maintenance, even risk our own survival if things go badly. Harold, Margaret began, but he held up a hand to stop her. I'm not finished. We also need to consider what the neighbors will think. People around here are already talking about our unusual marriage arrangement. Adding 6 mysterious children to our household will create gossip that could damage both our reputations permanently. Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes. Each of Harold's objections was reasonable, practical, and probably accurate. She had no counter-arguments that wouldn't sound naive or emotional. But as she looked around at the children, Emma still clinging to her skirt, Tommy swaying with exhaustion, baby James whimpering with hunger, Margaret knew that practical considerations couldn't be the only factor in their decision. You're right about all of that, she said quietly. But Harold, what's the alternative? Send them back to that ruined house to die? Turn them over to the county authorities who might separate them and place them in institutions? Pretend we never found them and let someone else deal with the consequences? Harold finally turned around, and Margaret was surprised to see that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. There is no good alternative, he said heavily. That's what makes this so difficult. Any choice we make will have consequences we're not prepared for. Little Emma, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the solemn attention of a child who had learned that grown-up decisions directly affected her survival, suddenly spoke up. Mister, are you Margaret's husband? Harold looked down at her, his expression gentling despite his obvious stress. Yes, I am. Are you going to take care of Margaret? Yes, I am. Emma nodded seriously. Then you should let us stay. Margaret took care of us when we were scared and cold. We can help take care of her too. The simple logic of a child's perspective seemed to cut through all of Harold's practical objections more effectively than any argument Margaret could have made. Harold stared at Emma for a long moment, then looked around at the other children, finally letting his gaze rest on Margaret's face. This is going to change everything, he said quietly. Our marriage, our life here, our future plans. Nothing will be the same. I know, Margaret replied. I'm sorry for making such a big decision without consulting you, but Harold, I'm not sorry for saving their lives. Harold walked over to where Tommy was still swaying with exhaustion and gently lifted the little boy into his arms. Tommy immediately snuggled against Harold's chest with the trusting abandonment of a child who had been starved for adult protection. We'll need more beds, Harold said practically. More blankets, more food, probably more firewood to keep the house warm enough for sick children. I'll have to make a trip to town for supplies as soon as the weather clears. Margaret felt a surge of relief so intense it made her dizzy. I mean, we're going to try to make this work, Harold said firmly. God help us all. We're going to try to turn ourselves into a family overnight. As if summoned by his words, baby James began crying with renewed vigor, his small voice rising. Above the wind outside, Margaret and Harold looked at each other across the kitchen full of needy children, and for the first time since their marriage began, they shared a moment of complete understanding. They were about to embark on something far more challenging than either of them had ever imagined, but they were going to face it together. Harold, Margaret said softly, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Harold replied with a rueful smile. Ask me again in 6 months, when we're all either thriving or completely insane. as Margaret began organizing the children for their first proper meal in what was probably days. She reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few hours. This morning, she had been a mail-order bride learning to manage a quiet household for two. Tonight, she would be a mother to 6 children who desperately needed everything she could give them. It was terrifying, overwhelming, and completely outside anything she had ever planned for her life. But as she watched Harold gently feeding Tommy while Emma helped distribute bread to the other children, Margaret realized that some of the best things in life came not from careful planning, but from the courage to respond with love when unexpected opportunities for good presented themselves. The real test, however, was just beginning. November 21st, 1887, evening. The next 12 hours would test everything Margaret thought she knew about motherhood, exhaustion, and the limits of human endurance. As darkness fell over the Morrison farm, she found herself facing the reality of caring for 6 sick children with only Harold's help and whatever supplies they could improvise from farm materials. The first challenge was simply creating enough sleeping space. Harold disappeared into his workshop while Margaret continued tending to the children, and she could hear him sawing and hammering with the focused intensity of a man who understood that proper rest was essential for recovery. When he returned to the house, he carried 3 small wooden crates that he had quickly converted into makeshift cribs, padded with horse blankets and lined with the softest fabric they could spare. "It's not fancy," Harold said apologetically, setting up the temporary beds near the kitchen stove where the warmth would be most consistent. "But it'll keep them off the cold floor and give each of the little ones their own space." Margaret felt a surge of affection for this practical man who could solve problems with his hands while she was still trying to figure out what the problems were. "Harold, it's perfect. You made these so quickly. Had to make something similar when my prize heifer had triplets last spring," Harold replied, but there was a pleased flush on his face that suggested he appreciated her gratitude. Same principle applies, just smaller scale. While Harold worked on sleeping arrangements, Margaret had been conducting her own assessment of each child's medical condition. What she discovered was both heartening and deeply concerning. The children were severely malnourished and showed signs of recent illness, but their basic responses suggested that they had been receiving some care until very recently. Emma, the oldest at perhaps 2.5, was the healthiest of the group. She could walk steadily, speak in simple sentences, and showed remarkable maturity in helping care for the younger children. But even Emma bore signs of hardship. Her clothes were little more than rags, her hair was matted and dirty, and she was painfully thin. Tommy, who appeared to be about 18 months old, was more concerning. The burn marks Harold had noticed were clearly old injuries that had healed badly, leaving permanent scars on his arms and back. But more troubling was his obvious terror of adult men. While he allowed Margaret to hold and feed him, he cowered whenever Harold came near, flinching as if expecting to be struck. The 4 babies presented the most serious medical challenges. Baby James, perhaps 8 months old, was suffering from what appeared to be severe malnutrition and possibly pneumonia. His breathing was labored, and he could barely muster the energy to cry. The little girl Margaret had bonded with, who Emma called Lucy, was burning with fever and showed signs of some kind of infection. The 2 youngest children, both appearing to be only a few months old, were so weak they could barely drink the warmed milk Margaret offered them. As Margaret worked to clean and feed each child, she found herself falling into a rhythm she had never experienced but somehow felt natural. Her hands seemed to know instinctively how to support a baby's head while feeding, how to position a feverish child for maximum comfort, how to soothe crying with gentle voices and patient attention. "You're good at this," Harold observed, watching. Margaret coaxed baby James to take a few spoonfuls of warm broth, Natural mother's instincts. Margaret paused in her work, struck by the casual assumption in Harold's words. I've never taken care of children before, she admitted. I was an only child, and in Boston, unmarried women don't generally have much contact with babies. Harold looked surprised. Could have fooled me. You handle them like you've been doing it for years. The truth was that Margaret felt as surprised by her own competence as Harold seemed to be. Something about these vulnerable children had awakened capabilities she didn't know she possessed. Every instinct told her what to do, when to be gentle and when to be firm, how to read the different kinds of crying, how to arrange the children so they could comfort each other while still receiving individual attention. As the evening progressed, Margaret and Harold developed an unspoken system of cooperation that felt surprisingly natural. Harold handled the heavier work, lifting children, moving furniture, maintaining the fires that kept the house warm. Margaret focused on the more delicate tasks, feeding, cleaning, administering what simple medical care she could provide. Neither of them had to ask what needed to be done. They simply moved around each other in the small space, each anticipating the other's needs. The most challenging moment came around midnight when baby Lucy's fever spiked dramatically. Margaret had been taking turns holding each of the children, but Lucy's condition deteriorated so rapidly that Margaret was afraid the little girl might not survive the night. "Harold," Margaret called softly, trying not to wake the other children, who had finally fallen into exhausted sleep. "I need help." Harold appeared immediately at her side, taking one look at Lucy's flushed face and labored breathing before moving into action. He disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a basin of cool water and clean cloths. "Fever's too high," he said grimly. "We need to bring her temperature down fast, or we'll lose her." For the next hour, Margaret and Harold worked together to save Lucy's life. They took turns bathing her small body with cool water, holding her upright to help her breathing, and encouraging her to drink tiny sips of water. Margaret found herself praying more fervently than she had ever prayed in her life, begging whatever powers might be listening to spare this innocent child. "Come on, little one," Harold murmured, his voice surprisingly gentle as he held Lucy, while Margaret prepared another cool compress. "Fight back, show us that spirit." Around 2 in the morning, Lucy's fever finally broke. Her breathing eased, her color improved, and she fell into the first peaceful sleep Margaret had seen from any of the children. Margaret collapsed into a chair beside the makeshift crib, utterly exhausted, but filled with profound relief. "She's going to be all right," Harold said, settling into a chair beside Margaret. "Crisis is over." Margaret looked around at the 6 sleeping children, each breathing steadily in the warm glow of the kitchen fire. They were still desperately sick, still facing an uncertain future, but they were alive and safe and cared for. For the first time in hours, Margaret allowed herself to feel the full impact of what she and Harold had accomplished. "We did it," she said softly. "We actually saved them." Harold was quiet for a moment, studying Margaret's face in the firelight. When he spoke, his voice carried an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Margaret, what you did today, going out into that storm, bringing these children home, fighting to save their lives, it was the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do." Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes. "I was terrified the whole time. Terrified I was making terrible mistakes, terrified you would refuse to help, terrified I wasn't strong enough or smart enough to keep them alive. But you did it anyway," Harold said. "That's what courage is, doing what's right even when you're afraid." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the peaceful sounds of sleeping children and the wind gradually dying down outside. Margaret found herself studying Harold's profile in the firelight, seeing depths in this quiet man that she was only beginning to understand. "Harold," she said eventually, "why did you agree to help, really? I know all your practical objections were valid. Harold considered the question seriously. When I saw Emma ask if we were going to send them away, and the fear in her voice, it reminded me of something my mother used to say. She said that sometimes God puts people in our path not because we're ready for them, but because they need us to become ready. Margaret was surprised by the philosophical depth of Harold's response. Your mother sounds like a wise woman? She was. Died when I was 15, but she taught me that the most important decisions in life aren't about what's practical or safe. They're about what kind of person you want to be when you look back on your choices. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma stirred in her makeshift bed and sat up, looking around with the disorientation of a child waking in a strange place. "Margaret," she called softly. "I'm right here, sweetheart," Margaret replied, moving to kneel beside Emma's bed. "Everything's all right. You're safe." Emma reached up and patted Margaret's face with her small hand. "Thank you for not sending us away." Margaret felt her heart swell with an emotion so powerful it took her breath away. "Emma, we're never going to send you away. This is your home now, yours and Tommy's and all the babies. We're your family." "Promise?" Emma asked, echoing her earlier question. "I promise," Margaret replied, and this time she made the commitment with Harold's full agreement. As Margaret settled Emma back into sleep, she reflected on how completely her life had transformed in a single day. 24 hours ago, she had been a mail-order bride, learning to manage a household for 2. Now she was a mother to 6 children who needed everything she could possibly give them. The challenges ahead were enormous. They would need to legally formalize the children's status, provide them with education, help them recover from whatever trauma had led to their abandonment. They would need to integrate 6 new personalities into their household routine, learn each child's individual needs and preferences, and somehow build a functional family from a group of strangers thrown together by crisis. But as Margaret watched, Harold gently adjust baby James's blanket and check on each sleeping child with the careful attention of a devoted father, she felt a deep sense of rightness about their decision. These children needed them, but Margaret was beginning to understand that she and Harold needed the children just as much. Their marriage, which had begun as a practical arrangement between 2 damaged people, was being transformed into something neither of them had dared hope for, a real family built on love, sacrifice, and shared commitment to protecting the most vulnerable members of their community. The hardest work was still ahead of them, but Margaret fell asleep in her chair beside the children's beds, filled with quiet confidence that whatever challenges tomorrow brought, she and Harold would face them together. November 25th, 1887. 4 days later, Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Harold hitch their strongest horse to the wagon for his long-delayed trip to town. The children had stabilized enough over the past few days that she felt confident managing them alone for the several hours Harold would need to purchase essential supplies. But her stomach churned with anxiety about what would happen when their secret became public knowledge. There was no way to keep 6 children hidden indefinitely. Harold would need to explain his massive supply purchases to the storekeepers, and word would spread quickly through Millbrook Township's tight-knit community. By evening, everyone within 20 miles would know that the Morrison farm had somehow acquired 6 mysterious children. "Remember," Harold said, pausing at the kitchen door with his coat half-buttoned, "if anyone comes calling while I'm gone, you don't owe them explanations. Just say I'll discuss it when I return." Margaret nodded, though they both knew that deflecting questions would only fuel more intense speculation. She had spent the past 4 days learning each child's personality and needs, and the progress had been remarkable. Proper food, warmth, and constant attention had worked small miracles. Even baby Lucy, who had nearly died that first night, was beginning to show signs of her natural personality. A surprisingly determined little soul who expressed strong opinions. About everything from food preferences to sleeping arrangements, Emma had appointed herself as Margaret's chief assistant, translating the younger children's needs and helping with everything from diaper changes to feeding schedules. Tommy had gradually begun to trust Harold, though he still flinched at sudden movements and loud voices. The four babies were gaining weight steadily and had developed the healthy appetite cries of children who no longer feared they might not receive their next meal. But Margaret knew that their temporary peace was about to be shattered. Harold's absence would make her vulnerable to unexpected visitors, and the children were too young to understand that they needed to remain quiet if strangers appeared. Margaret's concerns proved prophetic. Harold had been gone less than 2 hours when Margaret heard the distinctive sound of multiple horses approaching the farmhouse. Through the kitchen window, she could see 4 riders coming up the lane, all women, all dressed in their finest traveling clothes, despite the muddy conditions. Margaret recognized them immediately. Mrs. Catherine Whitfield, the banker's wife, and unofficial leader of Millbrook Township's social hierarchy, Mrs. Dorothy Chen, the minister's wife, Mrs. Ruth Kowalski, whose husband owned the largest farm in the area, and Mrs. Sarah Thompson, the schoolteacher who served as the community's authority on child-related matters. This was not a casual social call. This was an official investigation. Margaret quickly surveyed the kitchen, where evidence of the children's presence was scattered across every surface. Bottles, baby clothes, toys Harold had carved from scrap wood, and 6 small chairs arranged around the enlarged dining table. There was no point in trying to hide anything. Instead, Margaret smoothed her hair, straightened her dress, and prepared to defend her choices to the most judgmental women in the territory. The knock on the front door was firm and authoritative. Margaret answered it with baby Lucy in her arms, and Emma clinging to her skirt, while the other children remained visible in the kitchen behind her. "Mrs. Morrison," Mrs. Whitfield said without preamble, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. "We've heard some very disturbing rumors about your household. We've come to see for ourselves what exactly is happening here." Margaret stepped back to allow the women into her home, though their disapproving expressions suggested they had already reached their conclusions before arriving. "Please come in. Harold is in town purchasing supplies, but I can answer any questions you might have." Mrs. Chen moved immediately toward the kitchen, where Tommy was attempting to feed baby James with more enthusiasm than skill. "Dear Lord," she breathed. "How many children are there?" 6, Margaret replied honestly. All of them were abandoned and in desperate need of care. Mrs. Thompson, whose professional expertise with children gave her opinions special weight in such matters, knelt down to examine Emma more closely. "This child is severely malnourished," she announced, as if Margaret hadn't been working around the clock for 4 days to address exactly that problem. "They all are. And that baby," she gestured toward Lucy, "shows signs of serious illness. These children need proper medical attention, not amateur care from someone with no training." Margaret felt her temper rising at the implied criticism, but she forced herself to remain calm. "You're right that they need medical attention. Unfortunately, Dr. Patterson's death has left us without local medical resources. I've been doing everything I can with the knowledge I have." Mrs. Kowalski walked through the kitchen, noting the sleeping arrangements, the improvised feeding stations, and the general chaos that came with caring for 6 young children in a space designed for 2 adults. "Mrs. Morrison, surely you understand that this situation is completely inappropriate. A young woman with no experience cannot possibly manage 6 children alone, especially children whose backgrounds are completely unknown." "I'm not managing them alone," Margaret replied firmly. "My husband has been helping with their care." The 4 women exchanged meaningful glances that suggested this information was somehow more damning than reassuring. Mrs. Morrison, Mrs. Whitfield, said carefully, There are proper procedures for dealing with abandoned children. The county has institutions specifically designed to handle such situations. These children should be turned over to the authorities immediately. Margaret felt ice forming in her chest. What kind of institutions? Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat uncomfortably. Well, there's the county orphanage in Lincoln, though I understand it's rather overcrowded at present. Children of appropriate age would be eligible for placement with families seeking adoption, though of course babies and sickly children are more difficult to place. And what happens to the children who can't be placed? Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The county workhouse takes older children who can contribute to their own support. Mrs. Chen replied delicately. It's not ideal, but it provides basic shelter and food while teaching valuable work skills. Margaret had heard enough about county workhouses to know that they were essentially prisons where children were subjected to brutal labor conditions and minimal care. The idea of sending Emma or Tommy to such a place made her physically sick. These children are not going to any county institutions, Margaret said firmly. They have a home here, and Harold and I intend to provide for them. Mrs. Whitfield's eyebrows rose sharply. Mrs. Morrison, I don't think you understand the legal complexities involved. You cannot simply claim ownership of abandoned children. Without proper documentation and court approval, there are laws governing such situations. Then we'll comply with whatever legal requirements are necessary, Margaret replied. But these children are staying here. Mrs. Kowalski leaned forward, her expression a mixture of concern and condescension. My dear, you've been married less than a month. You barely know your husband, and he certainly didn't agree to take on 6 children when he arranged for your marriage. This situation is putting tremendous strain on a relationship that hasn't had time to develop properly. The criticism hit close to home because Margaret knew there was truth in it. Her impulsive decision to rescue the children had fundamentally altered the terms of her marriage to Harold, and she had no idea how their relationship would evolve under such pressure. But before Margaret could respond, Emma stepped forward and spoke up in her clear, serious voice. "The lady took care of us when we were cold and hungry," Emma announced, looking directly at Mrs. Whitfield, "and the man made us beds and helped when Lucy was sick. They're nice people who don't hurt children." The simple declaration carried more moral weight than any of the adults' complicated arguments. Mrs. Thompson knelt down to Emma's level, her expression softening slightly. "Sweetheart, these ladies are worried about making sure you and the other children are safe and properly cared for. Don't you want to live somewhere with lots of other children to play with?" Emma shook her head firmly. "Want to stay with Margaret and Harold. They promised we could stay." Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes at Emma's loyalty, but Mrs. Chen's next words brought her back to the harsh realities of their situation. "Mrs. Morrison, regardless of your good intentions, you simply don't have the resources to properly care for 6 children. Where will they sleep when they outgrow those makeshift beds? How will you feed and clothe them as they grow? What about education, medical care, preparing them for productive adult lives? One impulsive act of charity doesn't constitute a long-term plan for child welfare." Before Margaret could answer, the sound of Harold's wagon returning provided a welcome reprieve. Through the window, she could see him pulling up to the house with the wagon loaded with supplies, far more supplies than any 2-person household would need. Harold's entrance into the kitchen brought an immediate change in the room's dynamics. The 4 visiting women straightened into formal postures, clearly prepared to present their concerns to the male head of household, who presumably had final authority over family decisions. "Ladies," Harold said politely, removing his hat and taking in the situation with a quick glance. "I wasn't expecting visitors today." Mrs. Whitfield stepped forward as the designated spokesperson. Mr. Morrison, we've come to discuss the concerning situation we've discovered in your household. Your wife has apparently taken in 6 abandoned children without proper consideration of the legal and practical implications. Harold's expression remained carefully neutral as he listened to Mrs. Whitfield's summary of their concerns. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying each of the children before responding. "Ladies, I appreciate your concern for child welfare," Harold said finally, "but I believe you may have misunderstood the situation. My wife didn't take in these children without my knowledge or consent. We made the decision together to provide them with a safe home." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude at Harold's support. Even though she knew his statement wasn't entirely accurate, Mrs. Thompson leaned forward. "Mr. Morrison, surely you understand that good intentions aren't sufficient. These children need proper legal guardianship, regular medical care, education, and preparation for their adult lives. Can you honestly say you're prepared to provide all of that?" Harold walked over to where Tommy was sitting on the floor, playing with a wooden horse Harold had carved for him. The little boy immediately reached up to be held, showing none of the fear he had initially displayed around adult men. "Mrs. Thompson," Harold said, lifting Tommy easily, "can you honestly say that the county orphanage or workhouse would provide better care than these children are receiving here?" The question hung in the air unanswered because everyone in the room knew the truth about institutional childcare in the 1880s. Mrs. Kowalski tried a different approach. "Mr. Morrison, we're also concerned about the impact on your marriage. You and your wife are still getting to know each other. Adding 6 children to your household creates pressures that could destroy your relationship before it has a chance to develop." Harold looked directly at Margaret, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. "Mrs. Kowalski," Harold said quietly, "discovering that my wife has the courage to save 6 innocent lives and the dedication to care for them day and night has taught me more about her character than months of ordinary conversation ever could. If anything, this situation has strengthened our marriage rather than threatening it." The simple declaration left the visiting women with no effective response. They made a few more attempts to convince Harold and Margaret to reconsider their decision, but their arguments carried less weight in the face of Harold's unwavering support for his wife's actions. As the 4 women finally prepared to leave, Mrs. Chen delivered a parting warning. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison, we hope you understand that this matter cannot simply be ignored. There will be questions from county authorities, and you'll need to provide proper documentation of your legal right to care for these children." "We understand," Harold replied, "and will comply with whatever legal requirements are necessary." After the visitors departed, Margaret and Harold stood in their kitchen, surrounded by 6 children who were blissfully unaware of how close they had come to being separated and sent to institutions. "Harold," Margaret said softly, "thank you for supporting me. I know this isn't what you bargained for when you agreed to marry me." Harold was quiet for a moment, watching baby Lucy attempt to crawl across the kitchen floor with determined concentration. "Margaret," he said finally, "when I placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride, I thought I wanted someone who would quietly manage my household and not disrupt my carefully ordered life. What I got instead was a woman brave enough to rescue 6 children from certain death and loving enough to fight the entire community to protect them." He paused, then looked directly into Margaret's eyes. "I've never been more grateful to be wrong about what I thought I wanted." As evening fell over the Morrison farm, Margaret realized that their real challenges were just beginning. Legal battles, community pressure, and the enormous practical demands of raising 6 children would test every aspect of their still new marriage. But for the first time since she had stepped off the train in Millbrook Township, Margaret felt truly confident about her future. She had found not just a safe home, but a partner who would stand beside her when standing was difficult, and a purpose that made all the risks worthwhile. December 8th, 1887, 2 weeks later, the official letter arrived on a bitter Tuesday morning, delivered by a county clerk who rode through falling snow to serve legal documents that would change everything. Margaret's hands trembled as she read. The formal language that transformed their family crisis into a legal battle with consequences none of them had fully anticipated. County of Lancaster hereby orders an immediate investigation into the custody and welfare of 6 minor children currently residing at the Morrison farm. Said investigation to determine proper legal guardianship and ensure compliance with territorial child welfare statutes. Harold read over Margaret's shoulder, his jaw tightening with each formal phrase. The children were playing quietly nearby, Emma helping Tommy stack wooden blocks while Margaret fed baby Lucy, completely unaware that their future was being decided by strangers in government offices. "They're coming tomorrow," Harold said grimly. County investigator, territorial judge, and a representative from the Children's Aid Society. Full official inspection. Margaret felt her stomach drop. 2 weeks of caring for the children had created routines, bonds, and the beginning of what felt like a real family. The children had gained weight, recovered their health, and begun to show their individual personalities. Emma had started teaching the younger ones simple songs. Tommy had overcome most of his fear of adult men, and even the babies had developed distinct preferences for food, toys, and sleeping arrangements. But none of that would matter to officials who measured child welfare by bureaucratic standards rather than love and care. "What exactly are they investigating?" Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer would be everything about their lives. Harold scanned the letter again. Legal basis for custody, adequacy of housing and medical care, financial resources, moral fitness of guardians, and, he paused, his expression darkening, the propriety of our marriage arrangement given the unusual circumstances of these children's arrival. The last phrase carried implications that made Margaret's cheeks burn with anger and embarrassment. Clearly, someone had suggested that their mail-order marriage and sudden acquisition of 6 children represented some kind of moral failing or deception. "Harold," Margaret said carefully, "what happens if they decide we're not suitable guardians?" "The children get placed in county custody pending more permanent arrangements," Harold replied flatly. "Orphanage, workhouse, or separated among different families willing to take individual children. The thought of Emma and Tommy being torn away from each other, of baby Lucy being sent to an overcrowded institution, of any of these children losing the security they had just begun to trust, made Margaret physically ill. "We won't let that happen," she said fiercely. "Whatever these officials want to see, whatever standards they want us to meet, we'll find a way." Harold's expression was troubled, but determined. "Margaret, we need to be realistic about what we're facing. These people have the power to remove the children, regardless of what we want or what's best for them. We need legal help, and we need it today." The nearest lawyer was in Fremont, a 2-day journey under good conditions. In December snow, the trip would be dangerous and time-consuming. But Harold was right. They needed professional guidance before facing county officials who clearly intended to find fault with their arrangements. "I'll go to Fremont," Harold said, already planning the logistics. "Leave at first light, push hard, hopefully be back before the investigators arrive. But Margaret, that means you'll be alone here when they come." The prospect of facing a formal investigation without Harold's support terrified Margaret, but she forced herself to think practically. "What should I tell them? How should I explain how the children came to be here?" "The truth," Harold said simply. "You heard crying, you investigated, you found 6 children who would have died without intervention. Everything you did was motivated by humanitarian concern for their welfare." Margaret nodded, but she knew the truth was more complicated than Harold's summary suggested. Her decision to bring the children home had been impulsive and emotional, rather than carefully considered. She had disrupted their lives, created legal complications, and put Harold in a position where he had to choose between supporting her actions or protecting his own interests. The next morning, Harold left for Fremont in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying letters of credit and a desperate hope that he could find a lawyer willing to take on their case. Margaret watched him disappear into the snowy landscape, then turned her attention to preparing for the most important performance of her life. If county officials were going to inspect their household, Margaret was determined to show them a home where children were thriving under loving care. She spent the morning organizing every aspect of their domestic arrangements, cleaning the house until it gleamed, preparing nutritious meals that demonstrated the children's healthy appetites, and arranging the sleeping areas to show that each child had adequate space and comfort. More importantly, Margaret coached the children on how to behave during the inspection. Emma, who understood more than the others, listened solemnly as Margaret explained that important visitors were coming to ask questions about their family. "Will they take us away?" Emma asked, with the directness that always caught Margaret off guard. "Not if I can help it," Margaret replied honestly. "But Emma, if these people ask you questions, just tell them the truth about how you feel here. Do you like living with Harold and me?" Emma nodded vigorously. "Like it lots. Want to stay forever?" "Then tell them that," Margaret said. "Tell them about the nice food and warm beds and how Harold made toys for everyone. Tell them about learning songs and helping take care of the babies." The officials arrived precisely at noon, their formal carriage looking absurdly out of place in the farmyard. Margaret watched through the kitchen window as three people emerged. A middle-aged man in an expensive coat who moved with bureaucratic authority, a younger woman carrying a leather portfolio and taking notes about everything she observed, and an elderly man whose judicial bearing suggested he was the territorial judge mentioned in the letter. Margaret straightened her best dress, checked her hair one final time, and opened the front door before they could knock. "Gentlemen, madam, please come in. I'm Margaret Morrison." The lead official stepped forward. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Franklin Webb, County Child Welfare Investigator. This is Miss Janet Holbrook from the Territorial Children's Aid Society, and Judge Samuel Mason. We're here to assess the situation regarding the 6 minor children currently in your custody." Margaret invited them into the main room, where the children were arranged as naturally as possible. Emma playing with wooden toys Harold had made, Tommy napping peacefully in his small bed, the babies content and clean in their improvised cribs. The scene looked like domestic tranquility, but Margaret could see the officials cataloguing every detail with critical eyes. "Mrs. Morrison," Mr. Webb began, consulting his notes, "I need to establish the basic facts of this case. How did these children come to be in your custody?" Margaret told the story as simply and honestly as possible. The mysterious crying sounds, her investigation of the Brennan house, the discovery of 6 abandoned children in desperate condition, and her decision to bring them home for emergency care. Miss Holbrook made careful notes while asking pointed questions. "Mrs. Morrison, did you attempt to locate the children's parents or notify county authorities before taking them into your home?" "The children were dying," Margaret replied firmly. "They needed immediate medical attention and care. There wasn't time for bureaucratic procedures." Judge Mason leaned forward. "Mrs. Morrison, while your humanitarian motives are commendable, proper procedures exist for good reasons. Taking custody of abandoned children without legal authority creates complications that serve no one's interests." "With respect, Your Honor," Margaret said, surprised by her own boldness, "if I had followed proper procedures, at least some of these children would be dead now. Emergency care couldn't wait for official approval." Mr. Webb walked around the room, examining the sleeping arrangements, the food preparation areas, and the general living conditions. "Mrs. Morrison, you and your husband have been married less than 2 months. Taking responsibility for 6 children represents an enormous change in your household circumstances. How has this affected your marriage?" The question was designed to elicit admissions of strain or conflict, but Margaret answered with complete honesty. Mr. Webb, caring for these children has shown me aspects of my husband's character that I deeply admire. His willingness to help save their lives and provide for their needs has strengthened our relationship rather than threatening it. Miss Holbrook approached Emma, kneeling down to the child's level with professional friendliness. "Hello, sweetheart. Can you tell me your name?" "Emma," the little girl replied clearly. "This is my family. Who takes care of you, Emma?" "Margaret and Harold. They give us food and warm beds, and Harold made us toys." "Do you like living here?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Like it lots. Want to stay with Margaret?" Miss Holbrook continued her questioning, speaking with Tommy, who was less verbal but showed no signs of fear or distress, and examining the babies for signs of proper care and nutrition. Everything she observed supported Margaret's claims about the children's improved condition and well-being, but Mr. Webb's questions became increasingly pointed and personal. "Mrs. Morrison, your marriage to Mr. Morrison was arranged through correspondence, correct? You had never met before your arrival." "In Nebraska, that's correct." "And these children appeared in your household within 3 weeks of your arrival?" "Yes. Isn't it rather convenient that 6 children in need of rescue happened to appear just as a childless couple was establishing their household?" Margaret felt a chill at the implication behind his question. "Mr. Webb, are you suggesting that we somehow arranged for these children to be abandoned so we could rescue them? That's not only false, it's insulting." Judge Mason raised a hand to calm the increasingly tense conversation. "Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Webb is simply trying to establish the facts. However, I must point out that regardless of your motives, you currently have no legal standing to serve as these children's guardians. Nebraska territorial law requires formal adoption proceedings or official custody arrangements for any long-term childcare situation. We're prepared to comply with whatever legal requirements are necessary," Margaret replied. "My husband has gone to Fremont to retain legal counsel specifically to address these issues." Mr. Webb made a note. "That's encouraging, but it doesn't resolve the immediate question of whether this household can provide adequate long-term care for 6 children with unknown backgrounds and potentially significant needs." Miss Holbrook, who had been quietly observing the children's interactions with Margaret, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Morrison, I have to ask, do you have any experience with child care? Any training in child development, medical care, or education?" Margaret felt the weight of the question. This was the heart of their vulnerability. She was an untrained woman who had acted on instinct rather than expertise. "Miss Holbrook, I have no formal training in childcare," Margaret admitted, "but I've spent the past 3 weeks learning what these specific children need. I've researched medical care, nutrition, and child development through every book and resource I could find. Most importantly, I've discovered that what these children needed most was someone who cared enough to pay attention to their individual needs and respond accordingly." Before Miss Holbrook could respond, baby Lucy, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation from her crib, began fussing with the particular cry that Margaret had learned meant she was ready for her afternoon feeding. Without thinking, Margaret moved to prepare Lucy's bottle while continuing the conversation, demonstrating the kind of intuitive responsiveness that no amount of formal training could provide. The officials exchanged glances that suggested they were reaching some kind of consensus about their observations. Judge Mason cleared his throat formally. "Mrs. Morrison, based on our preliminary assessment, it's clear that these children are receiving adequate care in terms of nutrition, shelter, and basic medical attention. However, the legal issues surrounding their custody cannot be ignored. We'll need to see documentation of your efforts to establish formal guardianship before we can approve any permanent arrangements." Margaret felt a surge of relief that was immediately tempered by the realization that their battle was far from over. The officials had not ordered the immediate removal of the children, but neither had they provided any guarantee of future security. As the investigators prepared to leave, Mr. Webb delivered a final warning. "Mrs. Morrison, we'll be returning within 2 weeks to review your legal progress and reassess the children's welfare. If adequate guardianship arrangements haven't been established by then, we'll have no choice but to place these children in county custody, pending more permanent solutions." After the officials departed, Margaret sat in her kitchen, surrounded by 6 children who had no idea how close they had come to being separated and sent away. Emma climbed into Margaret's lap, sensing her emotional exhaustion, even if she couldn't understand its cause. "Are they nice people?" Emma asked. Margaret hugged the little girl close, breathing in the sweet scent of her clean hair and feeling the solid warmth of her small body. "They're people who want to make sure children are safe and well cared for," Margaret said carefully. "We are safe," Emma declared with absolute confidence. "You and Harold keep us safe." As evening approached and Harold still hadn't returned from Fremont, Margaret found herself facing the most uncertain night since the children's arrival. The official inspection had gone better than she had feared, but not as well as she had hoped. They had bought time, but time that came with conditions they might not be able to meet. Looking around at the 6 children who had become the center of her world, Margaret made a silent promise that whatever legal battles lay ahead, whatever bureaucratic obstacles they faced, she would find a way to keep this family together. She had discovered that love was not just an emotion, but an action, and she was prepared to fight for the right to continue taking that action on behalf of 6 small souls who had already suffered too much loss in their brief lives. December 10th, 1887. 2 days later, Harold returned from Fremont at dawn, his face grim with exhaustion and troubling news. Margaret met him at the door with hot coffee and baby Lucy in her arms, immediately sensing that his mission had uncovered complications beyond simple legal procedures. "The lawyer will help us," Harold said without preamble. "But Margaret, what?" "He told me changes everything we thought we knew about these children." Margaret felt her stomach clench with dread. Over the past 3 weeks, she had deliberately avoided thinking too deeply about the children's origins, focusing instead on their immediate needs. But she had always known that eventually, questions about their past would demand answers. "What did he find out?" she asked, settling into a chair beside Harold while keeping Lucy close for comfort. Harold pulled out a folder of official documents, his expression troubled. "Attorney Jameson has contacts in the Territorial Records Office. He was able to trace some information about the children based on the descriptions I provided." Margaret braced herself for revelations that might complicate their custody fight even further. "Emma and Tommy are siblings," Harold began. "Their parents were Samuel and Mary Fletcher, homesteaders who claimed land about 40 miles east of here 2 years ago. Samuel Fletcher died of influenza last winter, and Mary Fletcher died giving birth to a stillborn baby this past August." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes at the confirmation of Emma's simple explanation. "Mama sick, Papa gone." These children had lost everything before being abandoned. "But that's only 2 of the children," she pointed out. "What about the babies?" Harold's expression grew even more troubled. "That's where it gets complicated. According to county records, Mary Fletcher had been taking in abandoned infants, babies whose mothers died in childbirth, children whose families couldn't care for them, foundlings left on church steps. She was operating an unofficial orphanage out of her homestead." Margaret stared at Harold as the implications sank in. She was caring for all 6 children alone after her husband died. For several months, yes. Neighbors reported seeing her in town, purchasing supplies for multiple children. though no one realized how many she was caring for or how desperate her situation had become. Margaret thought about the lady Emma had mentioned, the woman who had cared for them before she went away. Mary Fletcher had been a widow struggling to care for her own children, plus 4 abandoned babies, while dealing with grief, poverty, and isolation. What happened to her? Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer would break her heart. Harold consulted his notes grimly. Mary Fletcher was found dead in her cabin in early November. Natural causes, malnutrition and exhaustion, according to the county coroner. The children were missing when neighbors finally checked on the property. Margaret felt a chill of horror. Someone took 6 children from a dead woman's house and left them in that ruin to die? That's what it looks like, Attorney Jameson thinks. Someone, probably relatives who didn't want to be burdened with the children, moved them to the Brennan house to avoid legal responsibility for their care. The cruelty of abandoning 6 grieving, traumatized children in a freezing, derelict building made Margaret physically sick. Emma and Tommy had lost both parents, then watched their caretaker die, then been deliberately abandoned by adults who should have protected them. Harold, Margaret said, her voice shaking with rage, these children have been through horrors that would break most adults, and someone just dumped them like unwanted cargo. There's more, Harold said quietly. Jameson discovered that Mary Fletcher had written to the Territorial Children's Aid Society multiple times, requesting help with the foundling children. She offered to continue caring for them if the territory would provide financial support, but her letters were apparently ignored. Margaret felt a surge of fury at the bureaucratic indifference that had contributed to this tragedy. The same people who are now investigating our fitness to care for these children ignored a desperate woman's pleas for help. Worse than that, Harold replied. Jameson found copies of the correspondence. The Children's Aid Society knew about Mary Fletcher's situation and chose not to intervene because her unofficial orphanage wasn't properly licensed. The bitter irony was staggering. The same officials who were now questioning Margaret and Harold's legal authority to care for the children had allowed a previous caretaker to struggle alone without support until she died of exhaustion. But Harold, Margaret said, trying to find hope in the legal complexities, doesn't this information help our case? We can prove that the children were genuinely abandoned, that they had no other options for care. Harold nodded slowly. Jameson thinks the documentation will help, especially since it shows that county authorities failed in their responsibility to these children before we found them. But there are still legal hurdles. Margaret waited for the bad news she could see in Harold's expression. The Fletcher children, Emma and Tommy, may have relatives who could claim legal custody. Jameson is investigating, but if living family members exist, they would have stronger legal claims than we do. The thought of losing Emma and Tommy to relatives who might be the same people who had abandoned them in the Brennan house filled Margaret with panic. Harold, what if these relatives are the ones who left them to die? That's what Jameson is trying to determine. But even if we can prove neglect or abandonment, custody battles with blood relatives are difficult to win. Margaret looked down at baby Lucy, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, blissfully unaware that her future was being decided by legal technicalities and family politics she was too young to understand. What about the other babies? Margaret asked. The foundlings Mary Fletcher was caring for? That's potentially easier, Harold said with the first hint of optimism he had shown. Children with no identifiable relatives can be placed for adoption through proper legal channels. Jameson thinks we have a strong case for adopting the 4 babies, especially given the documented care we've provided. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and heartbreak. The possibility of legally adopting 4 of the children was wonderful, but the thought of losing Emma and Tommy, the children she had bonded with most deeply, was almost unbearable. "Harold," she said carefully, "what happens if we can only keep some of the children? What happens if the families get broken up?" Harold was quiet for a long moment. Studying Margaret's face with the careful attention she had learned meant he was making important decisions. "Margaret," he said finally, "before we go any further with legal proceedings, I need to ask you something, directly. If we can only keep some of these children, if the legal system forces us to choose between fighting for all of them or guaranteeing the security of a few, what do you want to do?" The question cut to the heart of Margaret's deepest fears. She had promised Emma that they would never send her away, had bonded with each child individually, had begun to think of all 6 as equally important members of their family. "I want to keep them all together," Margaret said firmly. "These children have lost everyone they've ever loved. They've bonded with each other. They've become siblings through shared trauma and survival. Separating them now would be another form of abandonment." Harold nodded approvingly. "That's what I hoped you'd say. Jameson warned me that fighting for all 6 children would be more expensive, more complicated, and less likely to succeed than accepting a partial arrangement." "I don't care about the difficulties," Margaret replied. "These children deserve advocates who will fight for their best interests, not their most convenient placement." Before Harold could respond, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing her eyes and looking for her morning breakfast. The sight of Harold back from his trip brought a smile to her face. "Harold," she called, running to him for a hug. "Did you bring presents?" Harold lifted Emma onto his lap, his expression softening, as it always did when interacting with the children. "I brought something better than presents, sweetheart. I brought papers that are going to help make sure you can stay with Margaret and me forever." Emma studied Harold's face with the serious attention of a child who had learned to read adult emotions for survival clues. "Forever, forever? No one will take us away?" "We're going to fight very hard to make sure that never happens," Harold promised. "But Emma, there might be some people who say they knew your mama and papa, people who think they should take care of you and Tommy instead of us." Emma shook her head firmly. "Want to stay with you and Margaret, don't want other people." Margaret felt her heart break at the simple declaration. Emma had no way of understanding the legal complexities that threatened to tear their family apart, but her instinctive trust in Margaret and Harold represented the strongest argument for keeping the children together. As the morning progressed and the other children woke up, Margaret found herself studying each small face with renewed intensity. Tommy's shy smile when Harold helped him get dressed. Baby James's delighted giggles when Emma played peekaboo with him. Lucy's contented sighs when Margaret held her close during feeding time. The unnamed twins who had begun reaching for specific toys and showing distinct personalities. Each child had become irreplaceably precious to her, not just as a group, but as individuals with their own needs, preferences, and ways of contributing to their makeshift family. The thought of courthouse battles, custody hearings, and official determinations about their futures filled Margaret with a combination of rage and determination she had never experienced before. "Harold," Margaret said, as they prepared the children's lunch, "when do we have to make decisions about legal proceedings?" "Jameson wants to file preliminary adoption papers within the week," Harold replied. "That will establish our formal intent and provide some legal protection while we investigate the family situation. But Margaret, he warned me that once we begin formal proceedings, everything becomes public record. There will be newspaper coverage, community attention, and pressure from people who disagree with our choices." Margaret thought about the visit. From the 4 community women, the official investigation, and the whispered conversations she had noticed whenever she went to town. Their situation was already attracting attention, but formal legal proceedings would make their family the subject of very public scrutiny. "Let them talk," Margaret said firmly. "I'd rather face public criticism than private guilt about abandoning children who need us." That evening, as Margaret and Harold settled the children for the night, they found themselves discussing plans and possibilities that seemed both exciting and terrifying. Legal adoption proceedings would require character witnesses, financial documentation, home inspections, and months of uncertainty. But as Margaret watched Harold gently tuck Tommy into his small bed, while Emma supervised to make sure the blankets were arranged properly, she felt a deep sense of rightness about their decision to fight for legal custody. They had accidentally become a family through crisis and desperation, but they were choosing to remain a family through deliberate commitment to each other's welfare. Whatever challenges the legal system presented, whatever obstacles their community created, Margaret was determined to prove that love and dedication were more important than conventional procedures when it came to protecting vulnerable children. Real battle was just beginning, but Margaret had discovered that she was far stronger and more determined than she had ever imagined possible, and she wasn't fighting alone anymore. December 22nd, 1887, the courthouse, the territorial courthouse in Lincoln, buzzed with unusual activity for a winter morning. Word of the Morrison adoption case had spread throughout the territory, drawing spectators, reporters, and advocates from across Nebraska. Margaret sat in the front row of the packed courtroom, wearing her finest dress and holding baby Lucy, while the other 5 children arranged themselves between her and Harold like a small army preparing for battle. 3 weeks of legal preparation had led to this moment. Attorney Jameson had filed comprehensive adoption petitions for all 6 children, armed with medical records documenting their recovery, character witnesses from across their farming community, and most importantly, evidence of the systematic failures that had led to the children's abandonment. But the morning had already brought unexpected complications. "Your Honor," declared Thomas Fletcher, a thin, nervous man in an ill-fitting suit who had appeared claiming to be Emma and Tommy's uncle, "these children are blood relatives. Family law clearly establishes that kinship takes precedence over the desires of strangers, regardless of their good intentions." Margaret felt her heart racing as she watched Emma shrink closer to Harold's side. The little girl had reacted with visible terror when Thomas Fletcher arrived, hiding behind Margaret and refusing to speak to the man who claimed to be her father's brother. Judge Mason consulted the documents before him. "Mr. Fletcher, while blood relationship does carry legal weight, this court must also consider the best interests of the children involved. Can you explain why these children were found abandoned in a derelict building rather than in your care after their parents' deaths?" Thomas Fletcher's face reddened. "Your Honor, I didn't know about the children's situation until recently. I lived 200 miles away, and communication about my brother's death was delayed." Attorney Jameson rose smoothly. "Your Honor, Mr. Fletcher's claim raises several troubling questions. Our investigation revealed that he was present at Mary Fletcher's funeral in November, the same week these children disappeared from her homestead. We also have testimony from neighbors who saw Mr. Fletcher removing items from Mary Fletcher's cabin after her death. The implication hung heavy in the courtroom air. Margaret felt a surge of anger at the thought that this man might have been responsible for abandoning 6 children to die while he looted their caretaker's belongings. Furthermore, Jameson continued, Mr. Fletcher has failed to provide any evidence of his ability to care for 2 young children. He has no stable home, no wife to assist with childcare, and by his own admission, no previous relationship with Emma and Tommy. Judge Mason turned his attention to the children themselves. "Emma, can you come speak with me?" Emma looked up at Margaret with wide, frightened eyes. Margaret nodded encouragingly, and Emma slowly walked to the front of the courtroom, her small hand still gripping the wooden horse Harold had carved for her. "Emma," Judge Mason said gently, "do you remember this man? Is he someone you knew before you came to live with Mr. and Mrs. Morrison?" Emma shook her head firmly. "Never saw him before. Don't want to go with him." "Can you tell me why?" Emma's voice was small but clear. "He looks mean, and Margaret and Harold take good care of us. We want to stay together." Thomas Fletcher started to protest, but Judge Mason silenced him with a raised hand. The judge then called each of the older children forward, and their testimony was unanimous. They wanted to remain with Margaret and Harold. They felt safe and loved in their current home, and they were frightened by the prospect of being separated. But the legal arguments continued for hours. The territorial representative argued for compliance with standard adoption procedures. Thomas Fletcher's lawyer insisted on the primacy of blood relationships. Community members testified both for and against the Morrison family's fitness as parents. The turning point came when Dr. Elizabeth Warren took the stand. Margaret had never heard of Dr. Warren before that morning, but Attorney Jameson had located her through his network of contacts. She was a traveling physician who specialized in child welfare and had examined hundreds of cases involving abandoned and orphaned children throughout the Western Territories. "Your Honor," Dr. Warren said with professional authority, "I have conducted extensive examinations of all 6 children currently in the Morrisons' care. Without exception, these children show clear signs of trauma recovery, improved nutrition, and most importantly, secure emotional attachment to their current caregivers." She consulted her notes. "In my professional opinion, removing these children from their current environment would constitute a form of psychological abuse. They have already suffered multiple abandonments and losses. Forcing another separation would cause permanent damage to their emotional development." Dr. Warren's testimony carried weight that amateur community opinions could not match. When she concluded by stating that the Morrison household represented the most successful emergency child placement she had ever documented, the mood in the courtroom shifted noticeably. Judge Mason called for a brief recess, during which Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters she hadn't expected. Neighboring farm families, women from the church auxiliary, even some of the people who had initially criticized their decision to take in the children. "Mrs. Morrison," said Mrs. Chen, the minister's wife who had been part of the original investigating committee, "I owe you an apology. Watching those children today, seeing how they respond to you and your husband, it's clear that you've given them something precious that no institution could provide." Mrs. Thompson, the schoolteacher, approached with tears in her eyes. "Margaret, I've been teaching children for 20 years, and I've never seen transformation like what you've accomplished with these little ones. Whatever the judge decides, please know that you've already given them the most important gift, the knowledge that they're worthy of love." When court reconvened, Judge Mason's expression was serious but not unkind. "This case presents complex legal and ethical questions about child welfare, family rights, and community responsibility. However, my primary obligation is to determine what arrangements will best serve the interests of 6 vulnerable children." Margaret held her breath, feeling Harold's steady presence beside her and the weight of 6 small lives depending on the judge's decision. "Mr. Thomas Fletcher," Judge Mason continued, "while your claim of kinship is legally valid, your failure to provide adequate care for these children when they were in desperate need raises serious questions about your fitness as a guardian. Furthermore, your inability to demonstrate stable housing, adequate resources, or previous relationship with the children weighs against your petition." Thomas Fletcher's face darkened, but he remained silent. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," Judge Mason said, turning his attention to Margaret and Harold, "your decision to provide emergency care for 6 abandoned children demonstrates remarkable courage and compassion. The evidence shows that under your care, these children have not only survived, but thrived. Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes. However, the judge continued, formal adoption requires more than good intentions. It requires legal compliance, financial stability, and long-term planning for children's education and development. Margaret's heart sank, fearing that bureaucratic requirements would triumph over obvious success. Therefore, Judge Mason announced, I am granting full legal adoption rights to Harold and Margaret Morrison for all 6 children with the following conditions. First, the Morrison family will submit to quarterly welfare inspections for the next 2 years to ensure continued adequate care. Second, Mr. and Mrs. Morrison will establish education funds for each child to ensure access to formal schooling. Third, they will maintain detailed records of each child's health and development for territorial review. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers. Margaret felt Harold's arm around her shoulders as the reality of their victory sank in. They had won. All 6 children would remain together, legally and permanently part of their family. Emma ran to Margaret, throwing her small arms around her legs. We get to stay forever? She asked, her voice bright with joy. Forever and always, Margaret replied, lifting Emma into her arms while Harold gathered Tommy and the babies. You're officially our children now, legally and completely. 3 months later, spring 1888, the Morrison farm had been transformed by more than just the changing seasons. Harold had expanded the house to include proper bedrooms for each child, while Margaret had established routines that balanced structured learning with the free play essential for childhood development. Emma had begun reading simple words and helped Margaret teach the younger children basic letters and numbers. Tommy had overcome most of his fears and showed remarkable aptitude for working with animals. The 4 babies, now officially named Lucy, James, Michael, and Rose, had developed into healthy, active toddlers with distinct personalities and boundless energy. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in Margaret and Harold themselves. Do you ever regret it? Margaret asked Harold one evening as they watched the children play in the yard after dinner. The quiet life you thought you wanted when you placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride. Harold considered the question while watching Emma teach Tommy how to throw a ball. Margaret, when I wrote that advertisement, I thought I wanted someone who would fit quietly into my existing life without changing anything important. What I got instead was a woman who turned my entire world upside down and made it infinitely better. Margaret smiled, thinking about her own journey from desperate mail-order bride to confident mother of 6. I thought I was looking for safety and security. I found those things, but I also found something I never dared hope for. A real family built on love instead of convenience. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma approached with a hand-picked bouquet of wildflowers. These are for you, Mama Margaret, she said, using the title the children had naturally developed, because you saved us and made us a family. Margaret accepted the flowers with tears in her eyes, marveling at how completely her life had been transformed by a single decision to investigate mysterious crying sounds on a winter morning. The children who had been abandoned to die had become the center of a thriving household. The mail-order marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement had evolved into a deep partnership built on shared values and mutual respect. The community that had initially questioned their unconventional choices had come to recognize the Morrison family as one of the most successful examples of what determination and love could accomplish. That night, as Margaret and Harold settled 6 children into their proper beds in their expanded house, Margaret reflected on the unexpected paths that had led to this moment of perfect contentment. She had come to Nebraska as a woman with no choices, fleeing scandal and poverty. She was ending her first year as the mother of 6 children, the wife of a man she genuinely loved, and a respected member of a community that valued her contributions. The frightened young woman who had stepped off the train in Millbrook Township had discovered reserves of courage, wisdom, and maternal instinct she never knew she possessed. The desperate children who had been crying in an abandoned house had found not just rescue, but a genuine home where they were cherished as individuals and nurtured as family members. "Harold," Margaret said as they prepared for their own rest, "what do you think will happen next? What kind of future are we building for them?" Harold smiled, gesturing toward the children's bedrooms, where 6 small voices could be heard whispering goodnight prayers that included gratitude for their family, their home, and their safety. "Margaret," he said, "I think we're building the kind of future where 6 children who started life with nothing will grow up knowing they're worth everything. And I think that's the most important work 2 people can do together." As Margaret drifted off to sleep in the home that had become the foundation for everything she valued most, she whispered her own prayer of gratitude for the unexpected journey that had led her to discover her true calling. Sometimes salvation came from answering mysterious cries in the darkness. Sometimes it came from having the courage to act when others chose to ignore suffering. And sometimes, if you were extraordinarily fortunate, salvation came in the form of building something beautiful from the broken pieces of multiple lives. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore Morrison had found all 3 forms of salvation, and in doing so had provided the same gift to 6 children who would carry forward the lessons of love, resilience, and the power of chosen family for generations to come. The mail-order bride, who had discovered 6 abandoned babies, had discovered something far more precious: her own capacity to transform love into action and action into lasting change for everyone whose life she touched. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.